Somewhere in the Kuru Panchala country, south of the Himalayan foothills and north of the Ganga, a young man of 24 walks home after 12 years away. He has studied every Veda. He knows the meters, the rites, the genealogies of the gods. He walks with the particular straightness of someone who has mastered something, and his father, watching him approach, sees the straightness immediately, sees it for what it is. Not pride exactly, but the armor that forms when knowledge has been collected without ever being turned inward. The father's name is Uddālaka Āruṇi. The son's name is Śvetaketu. And what happens between them in the 6th chapter of the Chāndogya Upaniṣad, a text embedded in the Sama Veda and dated somewhere in the 8th to 6th centuries before the Common Era, is one of the most consequential conversations in the history of human thought. The text introduces Śvetaketu in a single word that lands without softening. He returns swell-headed and arrogant. The Upanishad does not make him a villain. It makes him recognizable. He has done exactly what was asked of him. He left at 12, he studied until 24, he learned everything a Brahmin of his lineage was expected to learn, and he came home full of it. The arrogance is not a character flaw, so much as a structural consequence of a particular kind of education, the kind that fills the vessel without asking whether the vessel knows what it is. Uddālaka does not shame him. He asks a question. The question is recorded at Chāndogya Upaniṣad 6.1.3. Tam adesham aprakshya yena ashrutam shrutam bhavati amatam matam avignatam vignatam iti. Have you asked for that instruction by which the unheard becomes heard, the unthought becomes thought, the unknown becomes known? It is a question shaped like a doorway. Śvetaketu has to admit he has not. And in that admission, the 12 years of acquired learning suddenly hover in the air between them. Not worthless, but incomplete in a way he had not suspected. What follows across sections 6.1 through 6.16 is Uddālaka's attempt to transmit something that cannot be transmitted by recitation alone. He does not begin with metaphysics. He begins with clay. He tells his son, just as by knowing one lump of clay, you know everything made of clay, since all forms are merely names and the substance alone is real, so by knowing one thing, you can know everything. The analogy is repeated for gold, for copper, for iron. It is an empirical opening, almost scientific in its patience. The ancient commentators notice this. Uddālaka Āruṇi is described in the texts as perhaps the first thinker to apply a form of experimental verification in philosophical discourse. He does not reach for the absolute immediately. He builds toward it through observation. He tells his son how Sat, the ground note of all that is, preceded creation, how from Sat came heat, then water, then food, how the subtlest parts of what we eat become mind, how water sustains prana, the vital energy, how fire gives rise to speech. The cosmology is intimate. It arrives through what you ate this morning. Then, at section 6.8.7, after the analogies have done their preparatory work, Uddālaka speaks the sentence for the first time. In the Sanskrit of the critical edition, it reads, Sa ya eshonimai tadat nyamidam sarvam, tat satyam, sa atma tattvamasi Śvetaketu iti. That which is that subtlest essence, the self of all this, that is the truth, that is the self. And thou, O Śvetaketu, art it. The formula is compact, but its components need to be held separately before they can be held together. Tat means that, the absolute, which the chapter has been approaching through its cosmological account of Sat, pure existence. Tvam means you, the one listening, Śvetaketu, the embodied person standing in the courtyard with 12 years of Vedic grammar in his head. Asi means are, in the simple present without qualification. Tat tvam asi, that thou art. 3 words, but the philosophical weight carried by those 3 words required centuries of commentary to fully unpack, and the unpacking is itself instructive. Shankara, writing in the 8th century of the Common Era, in his Chāndogya Upaniṣad Bhashya and in the Upadesha Sahasri, where the longest chapter is devoted entirely to this sentence, understood the equation as non-dualist identity. For Shankara, Tat refers to Brahman, the infinite and undivided absolute, and Tvam refers to the Atman, the innermost self of the individual, once stripped of everything contingent. The Sanskrit hermeneutical move he employs is called Bhagatyaga Lakshana, the part rejection, part acceptance method. The idea is that Brahman, as normally conceived, carries with it the limiting adjunct of cosmic power, Maya, while the individual self carries the limiting adjunct of personal ignorance, avidya. Both of these upādhis, limiting conditions, are set aside, and what remains, in both cases, is pure consciousness. That common residue is what the equation asserts. It is worth pausing here for the scholarly dispute, which the text deserves to have stated honestly. The Indologist Joel Brereton, followed by Patrick Olivelle and Wendy Doniger, has argued that the traditional translation is mistaken. The pronoun tat is grammatically neuter, tvam is masculine. If the intended meaning were you are that, the passage should read sa tvam asi. Brereton concludes the phrase is better rendered as in that way you are, Śvetaketu, meaning in the same way the elements dissolve back into sat, so are you constituted. This is not a minor quibble. It touches the entire philosophical architecture. The Advaita tradition has received and transmitted the identity reading for over 1,000 years, and Shankara's commentarial weight is enormous. But the grammatical objection stands on its own ground. Both readings are alive in the scholarship, and neither cancels the profundity of what the chapter is doing. Now the sentence is not spoken once. This is what the structure of the chapter enacts at the level of form. Uddālaka repeats tat tvam asi 9 times, at the end of section 6.8 through 6.16, each time following a new analogy, each time because Śvetaketu has asked for further explanation. The repetitions are not rhetorical emphasis. The Panchadashi of Vidyaranya, the 14th century Vedantic text, explicitly notes this. Sage Uddālaka mentions the great saying 9 times while instructing his disciple in the nature of reality. The student who returned home arrogant is now a student who keeps asking. Each analogy opens a new angle of approach to the same truth, because the truth cannot be grasped by a single approach. Consider the salt dissolved in water, from section 6.13. Uddālaka asks Śvetaketu to take a lump of salt, drop it into water, and bring it back the next morning. Śvetaketu returns and cannot find the salt. Uddālaka asks him to taste from the surface, from the middle, from the bottom. Each time the water is salty. The salt is nowhere visible and everywhere present. This, says Uddālaka, is how the self pervades all existence. You cannot isolate it. You cannot point to it. But it is the savor of everything. The analogy is not just poetic, it is epistemological. It teaches the student something about the nature of evidence, that the most fundamental realities leave no locatable trace, precisely because they are the medium of all tracing. Consider also the banyan seed from section 6.12. Śvetaketu breaks open a fig from the tree. Inside he finds tiny seeds. He breaks open a seed. There is nothing there. And yet the entire tree, its enormity, its shade, its decades of growth came from exactly that nothing. The subtle, says Uddālaka, is the source of the gross. That which you cannot see is more real than what you can. The visible is a kind of commentary on the invisible. There is a person, a parent perhaps, who has watched a child go through years of acquiring credentials, moving further from home with each degree, becoming fluent in a language the household does not speak, returning at holidays with a confidence that is not quite warmth. And one evening at the kitchen table, there is a question, almost accidental, that neither of them saw coming. The child, who knows so much, admits to not knowing something they thought they had long settled. The parent doesn't press. They wait. And in that waiting, something older than either of them enters the room, a recognition that the years of learning were preparation, not arrival. What the Upanishad names in this moment is not sentimentality, it is structure. The outer knowledge had to reach its limit before the inner question could form. The ninth and final recurrence of the Mahavakya comes at Chāndogya Upaniṣad 6.16.3. After the analogy of the man accused of theft who grasps the heated axe, and if truthful, is unburned. Sat, says Uddālaka, is the unburning truth, that ground of existence which the Jñānin, the one who knows, reaches after death and does not return from, while the one who is not known returns again into the cycle of becoming. The same refrain, Sa ya esho nimaitad datmyamidam sarvam tat satyam sa atma tatvamasi Śvetaketu. That subtlest essence, the self of all this, that is truth, that is the self, and thou, O Śvetaketu, art it. At this moment, the text reports, Śvetaketu has no more questions. The teaching of Atma Vidya, self-knowledge, is crystal clear to him, not because the logic finally convinced him, but because the analogies, repeated and turned over again and again, had gradually worn away a surface he had mistaken for a foundation. This is the pedagogical genius of Uddālaka Āruṇi that the commentators keep returning to. He does not begin with the equation. He earns it, and then he says it 9 times, not because Śvetaketu is slow, but because real understanding is not a moment of reception. It is a slow dissolving, like salt into water. Consider a man in his late 40s sitting with his dying father, who no longer remembers his name most mornings. There is a grief in this that has no adequate language, not the grief of loss exactly, because the father is still present, still breathing, still occasionally looking up with something like recognition. What the man finds, in the long hours of that bedside, is that the self he thought he knew, the son who needed the father's approval, the person shaped by all that inherited expectation, begins to feel less solid. What remains when the relational mirror goes dark is something quieter and harder to name. The Upanishad would say he is being introduced, against his will and by the most ordinary catastrophe, to what was always there, underneath the upādhi of role and name. What to carry forward into your actual day. The 6th chapter of the Chāndogya Upaniṣad does not promise that understanding comes quickly, or arrives in a flash of illumination. It shows a father saying the same true thing 9 different ways, through salt and seeds and rivers and blindfolded travelers, because the student needs 9 different angles before the wall gives. Whatever you think you know about yourself, the self built from years of becoming competent, of being a particular role in a particular life, the Upanishad asks one quiet, devastating question. Have you asked about that by which the unknown becomes known? The unheard is still waiting to be heard.